Hi, Laurie. Thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
Happy to be here. Thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's an honour to speak to you. I've read your book there. We can see in the background.
My book is Confessions of a Rock and Roll Name Dropper, My Life Leading Up to John Lennon's Last Interview. And it's my memoir, the story of my rock radio related life and career wrapped around December 8th, 1980, when I co conducted what tragically turned out to be John Lennon's last interview, mere hours before he was shot and killed.
It's crazy, like the whole thing around, like the book's a brilliant read, but obviously the whole thing around the day and leading up to the day, everything's just a really wild situation. And it's 45 years ago tomorrow. Can you believe it's 45 years since that day?
It's definitely a big anniversary, and it's made me feel just traumatic.
I bet it's like really hard, isn't it? Even all these years later, just to process it.
Absolutely. It actually gets harder and harder the more the time goes by.
Let's go back to the start then. Like you say in your book, on your way to New York, that you were really nervous but excited about the interview.
Absolutely. You betcha. And it's just we were told beforehand, don't ask John about the Beatles. Don't ask John about his past. It's all about the present. It's all about double fantasy. And that made me nervous because I was the one coming up with all the questions on the flight over. But I was so excited because during the interview, John was the one who brought up the Beatles. And he actually even mentioned his very first meetup with Paul McCartney, which was so cool to hear him talk about that story. And that's, of course, in my book.
So when did you find out you were going to interview John Lennon and Yoko?
Well, RKO's national music director, Dave Sholin, called me in November 1980 while I was working at Drake Chenault and had recently finished producing, writing, and creating a lengthy live performance radio show called SatCon 1. And he asked if I wanted to hear John and Yoko's new album, Double Fantasy, and then go with him to New York to interview them, along with our engineer producer, Ron Hummel, and Warner Brothers record exec, Bert Keane. And of course, I said yes right away. And I was so excited.
There is a spooky bit in the book though that with Yoko and the astrology. Can you tell us that story, please?
Well, Yoko's astrologist contacted us to find out about our birthdays, the times we were born, a lot of other things. And these details were supposed to help them determine what would be the best day to schedule our interview with John and Yoko. And sad to say, they came up with Monday, December 8th, even though John and Yoko were supposed to be on the West Coast and in Hawaii at that time. Darn. And that's the reason, at least one of the reasons, I still feel really guilty to have my birthday and the time I was born, and the other guys too.
Yeah, that is strange how it picked that day in it out of all the days like it could have been that day.
Absolutely.
So the interview took place in the Dakota, now obviously famous where John and Yoko lived. What was it like going in there?
Well, it was super exciting being taken from John and Yoko's main office to their private office. And that was incredibly furnished and decorated, including it had a beautiful, fluffy, white shag carpeting. And we were told to take off our shoes to walk on it. And so, of course, I did. And I especially dug this super long glass top coffee table they had. And it was framed in metal with serpents winding their way up and around each of the legs of the coffee table. And I remember that as I looked at these man made snakes through the glass on and off during the entire interview, I had this surreal feeling of, am I really here with John and Yoko? And yeah, of course I was.
So going back to that day, like and being in the Dakota, are you surprised there weren't more security there? Like obviously we know what happened later.
Well, I saw right away there was a Dakota security area outside the building and a team. But since weren't many people outside hanging out outside the Dakota while we arrived, it didn't dawn on me that there'd ever be any kind of a safety issue.
Was there a crowd there when you arrived, or was it later on when you came out?
There were more people when we came out, but still it wasn't really, really huge. In fact, I thought that was a little weird because I thought, my God, if I were here in New York all the time, I'd be outside the Dakota all the time. But there weren't really that many people.
Since that incident, like a lot of people and rock stars and stuff have obviously got more security and bodyguards. But just back to going into the Dakota, did you have any preconceptions on John and Yoko before you met them, like what you expected them to be like?
Well, to be honest, I knew I'd totally dig meeting and hanging out with them both. And I was hoping, even before our interview started, that we'd be able to become friends for life. At the end of the interview, they made plans with us to meet up in San Francisco. And hopefully that meant to me that we'd be lifetime friends and be able to talk about all the exciting things like relationships more, and which I really needed advice on, and everything that John and I had in common because we were both not raised normally by our family, and we both had spent time and really loved being on Bali in Indonesia. And I was looking forward to talking about all of that with him.
So when you get there, John and Yoko have just been doing the iconic Rolling Stone photo that came out later, obviously, when he's naked, curled up to Yoko. But Yoko was downstairs, so what was the introduction like?
Well, it was incredible to meet up with Yoko right away. And even though I still dig that sexy photo Annie Leibovitz took of the two of them together, I was especially glad that Annie never came down with either Yoko or John, since I'd had a really lousy encounter with that woman when I was living back in Seattle. And that's in my book, that story. And Yoko seemed super happy to have me, another female, with her in the office for the interview, since the other RKO guests were all guys, and she seemed to relate really well to me for that reason right away.
The first half of the interview, well, first half hour, sorry, is with Yoko. He's talking about like feminism and her side of the story on the album and everything. Did that help you ease into the interview when John came in?
Well, the first half of the interview was just with Yoko, and that was incredible. And I had the chance to chat with her about relationships while waiting for her husband to show up. And she told me her original connection with John was bigger than the both of them. And she let us know that she believed marriage is more of a spiritual bond than a commitment, especially their own. And Yoko said that she and John felt that dialogue was necessary within couples for men and women to improve their relationships. And that's how and why they created their first album together in years, Double Fantasy. She added that it was time for men to reach out to women, to their women, saying it's their turn to understand the situation and say, hey, let's start all over again. And she mentioned that in John's song, Just Like Starting Over, that's exactly what he was saying too. And she said she was choked up every time she heard that song.
So when John comes into the room, what is that like? Did he have like an aura around him?
Well, when John slightly opened the office door before walking in, I jokingly looked and said to him, can't you see we're in the middle of an interview? And he laughed like crazy and came in and sat down right next to me on the love seat in front of their awesome coffee table, and stayed super close to me and really friendly and complimentary for hours during our entire time together. It felt so great, and it still does for me to remember. Wow, sitting next to John Lennon, how amazing!
Is that the most starstruck you've ever been?
Well, I was really starstruck, pretty close to being the most. But of course, I was also super starstruck meeting Paul McCartney at the start of our RKO London interview with him and Linda and their latest lineup of Wings. That was back in June 1979. And I also enjoyed starting my first Fab Four member conversation with George Harrison in December 1978. And I dug having Beatles producer George Martin come see and speak with me at KFRC Radio in San Francisco in January 1980. They were all cool, and I was starstruck for all of them, and so many more interviews I've done.
Yeah, well, like you said, them two Beatles, George Harrison as well, you interviewed over the phone. Like, there's a lot of Mick Jagger as well, David Bowie. There's a lot of high class musicians there. But what are your personal favourite parts of that John Lennon interview?
So many of them. It's especially when John kept pushing his glasses down and looking at me closely, following my questions and comments, everything I said, saying to me, "Yes, love, exactly, Laurie, you're right." And that made me feel incredible. And so many other complimentary, validating things he said to me. And John told me and my RKO team during what tragically turned out to be his final interview that if he and Yoko decided to do a double fantasy tour, he definitely didn't want to perform any Beatles songs at all, which surprised us. And to emphasize what he was telling us, he gave us a funny imitation of Paul McCartney singing his song Yesterday. Ha! So we laughed at the time, and I still do when I hear it.
Yeah, yeah, I do remember that bit from the interview, and it's bittersweet how happy and excited he was, isn't it? Like when you look back now.
Absolutely. John was definitely quite positive and happy about being a house husband and a daddy and making music again. But he was still really upset about the 18-month separation he'd had from Yoko 5 years earlier when he was in Los Angeles. And he referred to that as the worst time in his entire life. And everybody else called it the lost weekend.
Well, I'm a big fan of John Lennon. Obviously, you are as well. And when you're a fan of these musicians, you like hearing their interviews and what they've got to say. Obviously, it all turned out bad in the end, but just with the interview, are you proud that you got that interview with him on his last day and you can see where he was at that point in his life?
Absolutely. And of course, before he got shot, I was really looking forward to creating the Loving RKO radio special that we were planning to air on Valentine's Day the next year. But of course, once John did get killed, I had to write that show right away, the next day when I left New York and got back to the West Coast. And that was so it could air around the world 6 days after his assassination, the Sunday after the Monday he was shot and killed. And I named it John Lennon, the Man, the Memory.
So with John and Yoko, you took Double Fantasy album, but you took the Grapefruit book that Yoko wrote with all the poems and things in, and they signed that for you. Is that a real treasured possession?
Oh, you bet. I especially dug the grapefruit autographs since they were both so excited. I brought my copy of their book with me. And of course, when I bought the book a few years earlier, I had no idea I'd ever meet the author or her husband, John, who wrote the book's introduction. And I feature John and Yoko's autographs in my book too. So now all my readers have them as well. So everybody who gets my book now gets John and Yoko interviews, excuse me, autographs.
Yeah, that's
And
brilliant.
they get the interview too, because it's definitely quoted a lot in my book.
Well, yeah, rightly so. Like, it was a big part of music history, but over the years, have you kept other like memorabilia from interviews or being on the radio or anything?
Of course, I've had nearly every rocker I've ever interviewed either autograph one of their singles, albums, or books for me, or I've been totally lucky to be able to take incredible photos with them. And I, of course, still not only have the albums, etc., but all those terrific photos of me with rock stars. They're hanging on the walls in every room of my house, including in my office, where I am right now, and in my home gym.
You mentioned there your book. I'll leave a link in the description if anybody wants to buy the book or check it out and hear about this last interview and John's final day and everything leading up to it in Laurie's life. And I'll also leave a link to the actual interview because it is on YouTube, the full interview.
It was RKO radio engineer producer Ron Hummel who handled the taping of our interview. And once we finished, John and Yoko gave me and my RKO team members autographs and took photos with us and made plans, like I said before, to meet up with us again in San Francisco in a couple of weeks to have dinner at Yoko's favorite Japanese restaurant together. And since I'm a sushi and sashimi fan, I was really excited. But I was also super thrilled to be able to become friends and talk with them both about, as I mentioned, everything John and I have in common and the relationships that I needed to look forward to in my own life. And I just knew that the guys on my team on their way to the airport were about to drop John and Yoko off at their recording studio session. But since I was staying at New York that night, I walked out of the Dakota. I began getting bugged and accosted and followed by this creepy guy who ended up killing John hours later. And that still horrifies me.
Yeah, that's crazy because in the interview he's talking about Imagine, he's John Lennon and what the song's about and everything. And then one of the reasons he says the guy killed John is because of his foley lyrics and stuff in that song. And he stood outside the Dakota while John's selling his story. It's really eerie.
Well, it was just it was just horrible. And I found out about John being shot hours later when I was outside my friend's apartment later that evening after we'd gone out for dinner. And we heard a reporter say that John had been shot and was in the Roosevelt hospital. So I grabbed a cab immediately and took a ride over there right away. Well, and I also wanted to say I never write or say that asshole's name who killed John. I don't want to ever give him the publicity, not when I talk to you or anybody else or in my book. And that jerk immediately began to bug me, like I said, when I came out of the Dakota after the interview and started following me up the street and kept saying over and over to me, "Did you talk to him? Did you get his autograph? What'd he say? What'd he say? What'd he say?" And I was just appalled and I was so creeped out. And he kept repeating that over and over. And I wanted to smack him and I wanted to push him down. But I didn't. I just kept trying to walk away faster. And finally, he stopped following me. But I feel really guilty now and have ever since because I still wish that I'd turned around and gone back to the Dakota instead to report him to the security team because maybe they would have been able to get rid of him, call the police, or just push him away themselves. Or maybe they would have looked at him and seen that he was carrying a gun in the pocket of the coat he was wearing, which tragically I did not, and I still feel horrible about.
I think obviously the guilt I understand, like you said, when you've come in that close encounter with him, but I don't think you should feel guilty really in the sense that he had that mindset to do it. Like I think if he'd have been told to go away, he'd have always come back. I think he just had the tunnel vision, didn't he? Because I think I read somewhere that he went earlier than that, and but he didn't have the right bullets or something, so he went back home to go back. So I think he just that was just what he was always going to do.
No doubt. And of course I say in my book, I was totally appalled and immediately felt horribly guilty, which I still do, that I hadn't reported the jerk to the Dakota security team. And I just, I still think about it and wonder why I didn't. And oh God, they could have gotten rid of him. And maybe that would have meant that John would be still alive, and he'd be 85 years old now and possibly still making music. And not just with Yoko, no doubt with his sons, Julian and Sean, as well.
Yeah, it was a real tragedy. Do you remember finding out that the guy that annoyed you was actually the guy who killed him?
Oh, God, yes. That was, as I said, outside my friend's apartment. I heard the reporters say that John been shot, and I didn't find out for several hours later when I was at the RKO radio network in New York doing interviews because I'd been the last interviewer. Um, and all of a sudden, we turned on the TV, and the reporter did come on and say that John wasn't just shot, he was killed. And they showed the guy who had confessed and was arrested. And I looked at him and I went, "Oh my God, that's that creep who followed me. That's that creep who bugged me and wouldn't shut up. And why didn't I report him?" And see, I still feel horribly guilty. It's the 45-year anniversary, and I still feel bad that I never reported that guy because he's still alive. He's still in prison. And he should be dead himself. They should have killed him right away, but they didn't. They let him live, and he's been in prison all these years.
Yeah, he's I don't know what he's had tried getting parole about 8 times, hasn't he? But thankfully he's never got it. Well, for his own safety, I think as well, he's never had it because I imagine if he got let out, the amount of fans and stuff, I just think wouldn't let him just walk around, would they?
I mean, I basically threatened to smack him or push him down, but I didn't touch him because I didn't want to. I wanted to keep going and get together with my friend, and I just didn't even want to listen to him. And finally, like I said, I was able to start running and walk away and get away from him. And it was just horrible to find out that he was the killer. And it was also super spooky to hear during the interview, to hear John say that he didn't want Yoko to pass away before he did. He didn't want to outlive her at all. And of course he didn't, which happened mere hours later. Ugh, I'm still horrified.
You mentioned there that when you found out the news on the radio that he'd been shot, you went to the hospital. Was that a professional thing or a personal thing? Like, what was going through your mind?
Well, I got to the hospital, got out of the cab, and they had Roosevelt Hospital had a great big glass front door window. And before I walked in, I looked, and there was Yoko crying hysterically, standing in the lobby. And I looked at her and I realized, oh my God, John just hasn't been shot. He's no doubt dead. And I was afraid. I didn't want to walk in to try and comfort her because I thought, oh my God, she's going to blame me for them being there in the first place for that interview and for him getting shot and killed. So I didn't walk in. I didn't talk to her again. Instead, that's when I went outside to the phone booth and called the RKO radio network in New York and immediately went over there and started doing interviews, basically with reporters all over the world who wanted to know about John's last interview. And then the next morning, um, uh, the Today Show requested from RKO that I be sent over to go on the show there, which I did, and that was pretty horrifying and made me cry and still feeling really guilty. And then right after that, I flew back to the West Coast and immediately started writing John Lennon, The Man, the Memory, my radio special.
So, I mentioned before the Imagine lyrics when he was talking about that. That was spooky, but a quote that gets took out of the interview a lot is, "I consider my work won't be finished until I'm dead and buried," and I hope that's a long, long time. Which obviously, again, looking back, is very eerie. Is what is the most memorable quotes for you from that interview?
So many. There were so many incredible things he said, not just the complimentary things to me, but things he said that made me super laugh. For example, when I brought up um, uh, talking with him about creating music instead of just talking about being a house husband and a daddy, um, he said, at first I said, I want to ask you about getting the urge to make music again. I emphasized it. And he burst in with a super loud, funny, and affectionate reply saying, Oh, it came over me all of a sudden, my love. I didn't know what came over me. And everyone started laughing in the room while I reacted confidently to his endearing response. I said, I know, it's like you were possessed. And he looked at me and he said, I was possessed by this rock and roll devil, you know. And when he said that, we all started laughing hysterically again and again. And he said, Was that your question? He asked me politely. Did I interrupt you? And I said, No, you got it, John. That was amazing. And then he started talking with Yoko about creating music and then said, just suddenly I had, like, if you'll believe it, if you'll pardon the expression, a diarrhea of creativity. And that still makes me laugh. And I often say that myself when I think about things that I do. Oh, yeah, like John Lennon, I had a diarrhea of creativity.
Well, it is even the bits in the interview like where he's talking about he won't let he won't let Sean watch TV adverts because they're bad for him and like the brainwash kids and stuff and they're like sort of even the things he talks about which you didn't expect like you say he spoke about when he first met Paul McCartney um, and just hearing these things that when you look up to somebody like that and then you realise they're just a normal human being and that's what I wanted to say. Like, you spent that last day with him, and obviously that killer had that thing in his mind, but he hasn't seen him as a human like you have on that last day. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I should say that that killer got his copy of Double Fantasy from our Warner Brothers executive who saw that the guy was bugging me when I first walked out. So he thought, oh, well, if I give this guy a copy of the album and have John autograph it for him, then he'll shut up and leave us all alone and won't bother anybody. So John, when he came out, autographed it for him. And a picture was taken of
That's
him
that picture
autographing.
that goes
Yeah,
round
for
of
the
him.
guy. And then he and Yoko got in the limo with the guys on my team and were taken to the recording session studio that they had a time for. And that's when I started walking up the street and was followed by that creepy guy who kept going worse and worse over and over.
Even like that with the autograph, I've heard somebody who was there saying he he didn't even say anything to John. He just put the autograph in his hand, and John was like, "Do you want me to sign it?" And he like nodded, and he was just really weird with him. Then like it's just really strange. And I saw in an interview after he killed him, obviously saying, "Oh yeah, John was such a nice guy and stuff." And it's like it's bizarre, really, when you think back.
Well, I would never watch an interview with that creepy guy ever. I never want to see him. I never want to see his picture. I never want to hear him talk. I basically don't even like him thinking about him following me and screaming at me. And oh, God, he just makes me sick.
Yeah, horrible. Like even the name just it sent shiver down your spine. Well, with the interview, I wanted to ask you. Obviously, if you knew what was going to happen, obviously it's hypothetical, but what would be a question that you'd ask John in his last ever interview?
Well, if there was any way I might have expected that it was going to be John's interview, I guess I would have asked him if we could all somehow just stay at the Dakota for the next few days and not let that creepy potential assassin get anywhere near any of us. But that would have meant canceling John and Yoko's recording studio sessions, plus the guys on my team not being able to fly home right away. So I definitely wouldn't have known what to ask him, thinking that it might have been his last interview because I never would have thought that in advance.
With the book, it shows you like a fan of the Beatles when you're younger. You go see them live, and then you're listening to them, you talk about them, and then later on, obviously, you interview three of them. So it kind of shows your journey. with them, and obviously that last ever interview, he's like that was the end of the Beatles that day as well.
Absolutely. It was super cool of me to be able to write in my book about all of my interviews and contacts with the Fab Four and their producer. And it was super cool for me as a little kid to see the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and then in concert at Dodger Stadium in Los Angeles in August 1966. And of course, their movies, especially A Hard Day's Night, which I still love. And I just saw last year when it played again at a movie theater here in LA. And it just made me cry and be so excited. And then their animated cartoon series when I was a kid was awesome for me to watch too. And of course, I dreamed all about meeting up with them when I heard them on the radio. And eventually, I wrote and co produced the longest Beatles special ever created in the US. RKO Presents the Beatles, which became really popular. And we expanded it from 14 up to 17 hours, changing the name to the one I'd originally come up with, The Beatles from Liverpool to Legend. And that's the one that Beatles producer George Martin said he loved and listened to twice in the UK. So that amazed me because it's super long.
Well, John wanted at the end of the interview, he wanted you to send him a copy of the interview, didn't he?
Well, what he wanted was the radio airing of the
Yeah, yeah.
interview. He didn't want us to send him a copy. I asked him if he did, and he said, "No, I want to hear it on the radio. Let me know when it's going to air." And of course, sadly, we couldn't do that.
So the book sort of finishes just after that fateful day. What was life like for you after that, professionally and personally?
Well, it was the radio special that I started writing and finished within a couple days after John getting killed. And then, as I mentioned, I named it John Lennon, the Man, the Memory, and it aired 6 days after he was shot and killed on the day that Yoko had the reminder for all of his fans to be totally quiet for 10 minutes and not say anything. And the thing is that they didn't have a funeral or anything like that. They just had that 10-minute thinking about John Lennon, which of course I did. And I also listened to my own special on the radio. And then I started writing my book wrapped around John Lennon years later because it took me years and years to feel a bit less guilty and also to have time and feel like I was able to do it. And it wasn't until the COVID hit in 2020 that TV production stopped. So I finally had time to actually start writing and thinking about everything and how important it was to me and get it published, within a few years after that. And so now it's still recently released and incredibly popular, which makes me feel glad. Everybody seems to really like reading it. And they tell me, yeah, when we usually read books, we just do a few pages at a time. But with your book, we want to read the whole thing all at once because the stories are so all connected and so great to your own life. And that makes me feel really cool to hear that. And I hope that, you've recommended to people to read the book as well and enjoy it and to check out the book website, confessions of a rock and roll name dropper.com, which they'll be able to look at and see where to get my book. Bookstores, not just in the United States, but in the UK at Waterstones bookstores and Amazon UK, that kind of thing. So it's really thrilling. Plus, it's got a lot of my TV show, radio show, and podcast appearances on it, and lots of things about me and all the Beatles I interviewed.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll leave a link to the book and the website, everything in the description of the video. But just to finish off, then, really, what is life like for you these days?
Well, for me, life these days gets harder as I get older. And the work I do is basically publicizing and promoting my own book, which is a lot of work, especially when you're new to it, like me. And I still am thrilled to be able to go see tons of rock star concerts. That makes my life so happy. I go see everyone from the Rolling Stones when they played to um, um, who else recently? AC/DC and the Psychedelic Furs and Billy Idol and Joan Jett and the Blackhearts. And one of my absolute favorites was just last week. It was Lawrence Judel from The Wings, who was great to see at a small venue here in LA. He did a solo concert, and it was just really exciting for me.
Yeah, brilliant. Like, it's great to see that music is still a big part of your life. And thank you so much for joining me. It's been great to speak to you and hear your stories. And like I say, I'll leave a link in the description to the website of the book and the interview as well.
Yeah, cool. I would love for people to be able to hear the interview. And unfortunately, I can't release it because it's not owned by me. It's owned by the company that bought RKO Radio when they went out of business. So what people do, and I really shouldn't legally tell them this, is go to YouTube and
Yeah.
find pieces of it which they can listen to. And also, my special, John Lennon, The Man, the Memory, was divided into 6 parts. It was a 3-hour special, and all 6 parts are featured separately on YouTube as well, so people can catch that.
All right. Yeah, I'll leave a link to that as well. Yeah. Thank you for letting me know. Yeah. And thank you for your time, Laurie. It's been great to speak to you.
Thank you. It's
Thank
been
you.
great talking to you too.